Catherine, an investigative journalist who had worked tirelessly for 20 years, had made a name for herself by exposing the misdeeds of others. She was now being celebrated, having just won the Royal Television Society's Outstanding Achievement Award. She reveled in the thunderous applause and the admiring glances of the crowd. Meanwhile, in another part of the city lived a man whose life was the polar opposite of hers, Stephen. He had been voted the most popular teacher at his school multiple times, yet he deeply resented the cheerful laughter of his students. The reason was a tragedy that had taken his son, Jonathan, from him far too soon. Finally, Stephen resigned. After losing both his son and his wife, he was utterly alone. His wife Nancy's clothes at home only brought him more grief, so he packed them all up and donated them to a charity. He kept only one item, a pink knitted cardigan. When he wore it, it felt as though Nancy was still holding him in her arms. The closet was empty, completely cleared of Nancy's belongings. But in a small crevice, Stephen found a forgotten purse, Nancy's favorite. Inside, the keychain held a photo of Nancy and their son Jonathan. Stephen broke down and cried. As the purse fell to the floor, a stack of Jonathan's old photos scattered everywhere. Jonathan had loved photography, and these were pictures he had taken during a vacation, landscapes, photos of him with his girlfriend Sarah, and a scandalous photo of a woman. Stephen would never forget that face. It was a young Catherine, the woman both he and his wife had come to loathe. After Jonathan's death, Nancy had moved into his room, surrounding herself with his photos and belongings. She never let Stephen in, but occasionally he could hear the sound of a typewriter. Stephen opened a long-sealed drawer and found a few of Jonathan's favorite things, as well as a completed novel, The Perfect Stranger. It was left by Nancy, and it meticulously documented the truth of Jonathan's death. Stephen used his connections with a familiar editor to get the novel published. The story was gripping and repulsive, and everyone who read it condemned the protagonist, calling her the worst person in the world. It wasn't long before Nancy's work became a bestseller, with major publishers scrambling to buy the rights from Stephen. But there was only one person Stephen truly wanted to see the novel. Catherine, busy with social engagements, returned home with her husband, Robert. She was exhausted and just wanted to get some sleep, but her nerves were suddenly on high alert when she saw a package. The novel, The Perfect Stranger. The cover read, "Any resemblance to the characters and events in this story is no coincidence." Catherine spent the entire night reading it, and memories flooded back. She ran to the toilet and vomited, feeling her perfect mask was about to slip off. As soon as dawn broke, she frantically burned the book. The contents made her feel like a filthy person, but she couldn't bring herself to confess the truth to Robert. Robert assumed Catherine's anxiety stemmed from the decision for their son, Nick, to move out and become independent. A decision Catherine herself had made. Although Robert didn't fully understand it, Nick was already 25 and living a directionless life. Robert managed a large corporation and Catherine was a renowned journalist. Their family wealth could sustain them for generations, but neither of them wanted to support a lazy child. Nick picked up the novel. It turned out a customer had left it behind a few days earlier at the department store where he worked. The customer had spent over half an hour with Nick, asking about different vacuum cleaner models, expensive, cheap, and lightweight, and was picky about both brands and prices. Just as he was about to make a purchase, he changed his mind. Before leaving, he placed a package on the counter. Inside was The Perfect Stranger. Catherine anxiously pressed him. "Who gave you the novel? What did they say?" Nick's answer was, "The protagonist is a self-centered bitch." In that moment, Catherine's composure shattered. She went to the editing office, where everyone applauded her for winning the award. Her assistant, Ji Soo, held her trophy with admiration. A rival, under the guise of congratulations, made some sarcastic remarks. But Catherine didn't care. They were a defeated opponent anyway. Her mind was consumed with the novel, and she couldn't resist asking Jisoo to investigate Stephen's current situation. Meanwhile, Stephen had already developed and duplicated the scandalous photos. He waited for Robert to appear below his corporate building, then went to the front desk with the package of photos. He told the receptionist it was a very important document that needed to be delivered to Robert immediately. These photos had the potential to tear Catherine's family apart. What deep-seated hatred could Stephen have for her to resort to such a malicious act? The story now goes back in time, many years before. Jonathan and his girlfriend Sarah had gone on a trip to Italy, leaving Stephen and Nancy to enjoy some rare, peaceful time at home. But tragedy found its way to them. One day, the police regretfully informed them that Jonathan, who was traveling in Italy, had drowned while selflessly trying to save a little boy lost at sea. The Italian police had confirmed Jonathan's nationality through his personal belongings and asked the London police to inform his parents to go to Italy to identify the body. After the police left, Nancy sat on the sofa, trembling and weeping uncontrollably. The couple rushed to Italy as quickly as they could. A person from the consulate picked them up at the airport. At the morgue, they saw Jonathan. The 20-year-old was in the prime of his life, but now he lay on a cold slab, smelling of preservatives. Nancy gazed at his face, muttering to herself and unable to let go. The couple went to the hotel where Jonathan had stayed to collect his belongings. On the table was a small knife, a birthday gift from Stephen. On the nightstand were some camera film rolls, documenting his time in Italy. Their next stop was the scene of Jonathan's drowning. In his heart, Stephen knew Jonathan was rebellious, and not the type to put others before himself. He never expected that the one time he acted heroically, it would end this way. The couple learned that the boy Jonathan had saved was also British, and the boy's mother, Catherine, had rushed back to London after the incident without even leaving a word of apology. Stephen and Nancy stood in the ocean for a long time, staring out, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of Jonathan in the distance. For parents, accepting the death of a child is an insurmountable struggle. Nancy submerged herself in a bathtub until she was nearly suffocating. The Italian police had told her that Jonathan had lost consciousness before he stopped breathing, and that the process wouldn't be painful. So Nancy wanted to experience if Jonathan had felt despair in his final moments. Jonathan had been closest to Nancy. Most of the photos he left behind were portraits he had taken of her. Stephen was never in them. Perhaps because of these photos, Nancy decided to get the film rolls from Italy developed. After that, Nancy's condition worsened. For 5 years, she refused to leave the house. Consumed by her grief, she insisted on moving into Jonathan's room, and Stephen even had to bring her meals to her. Over time, Nancy's health deteriorated. She was diagnosed with cancer and tormented by the illness day in and day out. Knowing her time was short, she finally left the house to meet with Catherine. She hated Catherine for her indifference after Jonathan's death. She also wanted to see the boy Jonathan had saved with his life, Nick. But even seeing Nancy's hair nearly gone from chemotherapy and hearing her cry about the pain of losing her beloved son, there was no apology in any of Catherine's expressions. On the contrary, she was evasive. She said she truly didn't want to relive that nauseating experience. Finally, under Nancy's curses, she fled in a panic. Later, Nancy passed away, but in the novel she left behind, she had fully written down the truth of Jonathan's death. Let's now see what kind of person Catherine was, according to Nancy. That year, Jonathan and his girlfriend Sarah were supposed to be traveling in Italy. Stephen and Nancy didn't like the rebellious girl much, but since Jonathan was a stubborn teenager, they indulged him. Italy was surrounded by a rich artistic atmosphere, but Sarah had no time to enjoy it. She received a call from her mother, telling her that her beloved aunt had been in a car accident and might not survive the night. She had to take the fastest train home. The couple said their tearful goodbyes, and Jonathan was left alone in Italy. Jonathan went to the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa, a lone traveler amidst a crowd of tourists. He wrote a postcard to Nancy, but throughout the message he never mentioned Stephen. Traveling alone was lonely, but one event changed everything. On the beach, Jonathan came across a woman with a child. He was instantly captivated by her elegance and beauty and took numerous photos. The woman, sensing she was being photographed, didn't get upset. Instead, she approached him and started a conversation. The sun cast a halo around her, making her appear sacred and untouchable. Jonathan was so flustered that he repeatedly avoided her gaze, yet he couldn't help but secretly steal glances at her. Their conversation was interrupted by her son, who said he was tired and wanted to go back to the hotel room to sleep. After a moment of internal struggle, Jonathan got up, followed them, took the bags from the woman and walked with her back to the hotel. The woman's son was so exhausted he fell asleep on Jonathan's shoulder. The two new acquaintances, not wanting the night to end, agreed to go for a drink after she put her son to bed. The woman said her son, Nick, was usually a heavy sleeper, and it was fine to leave him alone for a little while. They chose a nearby bar, and the woman's room key was placed on the table. After a few hours, Jonathan's shyness began to fade, but his furtive glances remained, revealing his strong attraction to the woman. Jonathan told Catherine that he had a serious girlfriend, Sarah, and that he was committed to being faithful to her. The woman also told Jonathan her name was Catherine. She explained that she had come to Italy for a vacation with her husband Robert and their son Nick, but Robert had to rush back to London for an urgent company matter, leaving her feeling lonely. As she said this, she stared at Jonathan without blinking, creating a charged, ambiguous atmosphere. Catherine was a mature and sensual woman, a veteran in the game of seduction. Step by step, she enticed the young and lustful Jonathan. He couldn't resist her advances. What happened next was inevitable. While Nick slept soundly in the small bedroom of the hotel room, the two strangers spent a passionate night together. Jonathan took many photos to remember the night. In the images, she was captivating, with every glance revealing raw temptation. After the night, both of them were exhausted. Catherine bought a small boat for Nick. Noticing Jonathan's camera lens pointed at her again, Catherine handed Nick over to a nearby caregiver and went with Jonathan to a restroom on the beach. He was completely mesmerized by this perfect stranger, and decided to end his trip early to go back to London with her. But Catherine had no intention of jeopardizing her marriage. She heartlessly rejected Jonathan's request and returned to the beach to continue spending time with Nick. Still feeling the fatigue from the night before, Catherine fell into a deep sleep on the sand. When she woke up sometime later, Nick was gone. There was a long drag mark on the sand, leading into the ocean, and she saw a small figure paddling a boat far out on the water. Naive and fearless, Nick didn't realize the danger of the sea. Catherine waded halfway into the water, but she was a poor swimmer and knew if she went any further, she might drown, as well as fail to save her son. In that critical moment, Jonathan plunged into the water without hesitation, and more people arrived after hearing Catherine's cries for help. Jonathan grabbed the rope of the small boat, and two men swam over to their location, saving Nick. But no one noticed that Jonathan, who had run out of strength, was struggling. No one, except Catherine. She saw Jonathan fighting and calling for help, but she was afraid that if he were saved, he would continue to pursue her, so Catherine chose to remain silent. In that moment, she wished Jonathan would never make it back to shore, and when tourists finally found Jonathan and pulled him out, he had already stopped breathing, just as Catherine had secretly wished. This was the story in Nancy's novel, and the reason Stephen sought revenge on Catherine's family. Robert had already opened the package Stephen sent. Inside was the novel and some photos. He immediately recognized his wife's face, and also knew exactly when and in which hotel the pictures were taken. The further he flipped through them, the more explicit the images became. Robert's hands trembled more and more, and he was consumed by anxiety and pain. Catherine's mother called to check in. She suffered from Alzheimer's, and the busy Catherine hadn't visited her in weeks. Seeing that it was almost time for Robert to get off work, Catherine quickly ended the call and sent him a text message, reminding him that dinner would be ready around 7 o'clock. Robert glanced at the text and irritably threw his phone aside. He thought that Nick had also been on that trip to Italy. Even though Nick was young then, and 20 years had passed, he must have some memories of it. Dinner was ready, but Catherine hadn't received a reply from Robert. She began to feel a bit angry and sent another text, scolding him for not letting her know if he wasn't coming home for dinner. After moving out of the house, Nick rented a dark, messy, and damp-smelling empty room in a delicatessen. Robert was undeniably disappointed in him, and that disappointment turned into anger, which he projected onto Catherine. Robert believed it was all her fault, that she had failed to properly raise their son, that she prioritized her career and her pleasure, and that she had neglected Nick. During their conversation, Robert learned that Nick had a girlfriend and was planning a trip with her, but they were short on cash and could only afford cheaper destinations. This prompted Robert to steer the conversation toward the trip they took to Italy 20 years ago and the encounter with Jonathan. But Nick insisted he didn't remember anything. Under Robert's persistent questioning, his tone grew increasingly annoyed. Realizing he wouldn't get any answers, Robert changed the subject, promising to sponsor the trip so Nick wouldn't have to be so frugal. Catherine waited up late in the bedroom, only to find that Robert had already come home. He looked at her like a stranger. When Catherine saw the photos on the table, she finally understood why his attitude had been so strange. Catherine wanted to explain, but the words got stuck in her throat. She just kept repeating, "It's not what you think," but Robert wouldn't listen to another word. After venting his anger, Robert left the house without a second glance, ignoring his wife's tearful pleas. Catherine called him all night, but he rejected every call. She wanted to explain her reasons for concealing the truth, and she wanted Robert to understand that her silence for 20 years was to protect him and Nick. But she didn't know how to begin. Robert wasn't fully sober from the night before. He chose to take the bus to his company. Stephen still had the preserved food Nancy had made. He had never been able to bring himself to eat it, saving it only for special occasions like today. His plan was going perfectly. Catherine also found out that he was the one who sent the novel and photos. Catherine thought that a reluctant admission of the novel's contents would make Stephen abandon his revenge, but Stephen could sense that she wasn't willing to apologize or take responsibility. This only fueled his anger. The perfect stranger was placed in a prominent position at a bookstore. The owner and publisher praised Stephen's writing and continuously cursed the female protagonist of the book, which gave Stephen a great deal of satisfaction. Catherine, a regular customer at this bookstore, came to pick up a book she had ordered. When she saw the novel at the front counter, she quickly fled in a panic. Robert found a restaurant and read the novel. It described the details of the affair so vividly that he felt he could physically experience how lost Catherine was at the time. Since marrying Catherine, Robert had always given her respect, support, and everything she wanted, standing by her side without hesitation. How could Catherine have betrayed him? Before this, when Catherine stubbornly insisted that Nick become independent, forcing him to live in a moldy apartment, Robert had never said a word against it. But after seeing Catherine's true colors, Robert began to side with Nick. Without a word, He picked him up and brought him home. He also packed a suitcase for Catherine, lying to Nick that she was leaving for a long time to cover a big story. Inside the suitcase were Catherine's passport and the wedding ring Robert had taken off. Catherine felt a bitter pain, but she went along with his wishes. Catherine went to her mother's house, her life in a total mess and feeling completely drained. Her mother didn't ask many questions, just looked at her with a pained, empathetic expression for a long time. Stephen launched the next phase of his revenge. He had a friend's student help him create a Facebook account. The profile and photo albums were filled with Jonathan's hobbies and interests, making it seem as if the 20-year-old was still alive online. Nick took off his shoes and lay on his bed. The house was so much cozier than the shabby apartment above the deli. Even so, he clearly sensed that something was wrong between his parents. Robert asked him if he was going to work the next day. Nick vaguely said he had a night shift. Once Robert went to his room, Nick quickly slipped out the door and went to a sketchy place. Most of the people there were like him, boys who had lost hope in life, and drugs were their only solace. Catherine slept in the same bed as her mother. Watching her mother's sleeping face, she couldn't help but cry, pouring out her feelings about the stress at home and what had happened during that trip 20 years ago. She didn't know if her sleeping mother heard her or if these words would enter her dreams and form fragmented memories. The next morning, it was pouring rain. Stephen stood outside Catherine's editing office, waiting until he saw an Asian girl appear. Ji-Soo, Catherine's assistant. She exuded an air of ambition. It was true. She had coveted Catherine's position for a long time. After hearing Stephen's revelation that the story was about Catherine, she ignored the fact that she was about to miss her check-in time and patiently sat down to listen to his entire story. Stephen gave Ji-Soo the novel, revealing that the female protagonist was Catherine, that she had an affair, and that she decided to let her pursuer die because she was tired of his persistence. Stephen added that even after he published the book, Catherine had threatened him. Ji-Soo's eyes gleamed with greed. Catherine called Nick again, carefully asking if he remembered anything that had happened during their trip to Italy 20 years ago. Nick impatiently repeated, no. He couldn't understand why both his parents kept bringing it up and angrily hung up the phone. He noticed a new visitor on his Facebook account, a boy who looked younger than him and radiated vitality and youth. Soon after, Stephen's phone notified him of a message from Nick. He began impersonating 20-year-old Jonathan, using phrases he had pre-written in a notepad to have a lengthy conversation with Nick. Nick had once accompanied Robert to a conference in Los Angeles and had visited Universal Studios. He boasted about his frequent travels, and Stephen's feigned admiration only fed his vanity. When Catherine arrived at the editing office, the atmosphere was strange. A copy of the novel sat on her desk, and her colleagues looked at her with subtle, knowing glances. It was clear they had all read the book. Ji-Soo, along with Catherine's rivals, launched a moral crusade against her. Believing the book's contents, they interfered with her work under the pretense of seeking justice for an innocent person, forcing Catherine to flee. She even slapped one of her rivals who wouldn't let up. Catherine's shining reputation among her colleagues was completely shattered. Nick often bragged to Stephen, who was disguised as a younger man, and Stephen gave him just enough emotional validation to make Nick believe they were good friends. Catherine showed up at Stephen's door to explain that things weren't as he thought, but he wouldn't listen or believe her. He only relaxed after he saw her leave. The time was right for Stephen's revenge to escalate. He asked Nick if he had read The Perfect Stranger, and what he thought of the female protagonist. Stephen then pressed further. The main character leaves her child on the beach and goes to the bathroom for a rendezvous with Jonathan. Does her desire really outweigh her love for her child? Nick was completely confused by the strange questions from this young man. Before he could answer, Stephen sent him a photo, a picture Jonathan had taken of his young mother and himself on the beach. Then a memorial photo of Jonathan followed. Nick found the face strangely familiar. He looked through the other person's photo album and was horrified to find that all the photos were of the same person from the memorial picture. Stephen kept sending messages, telling Nick that Jonathan was dead and that he was the boy Jonathan had saved. Before he could recover from the shock, a flood of photos poured in, Catherine's scandalous photos. Her every expression and action were exactly as described in the novel's account of the affair. Stephen's revenge was more than half complete. Nick's beliefs were utterly shattered. He was forced to accept that his mother didn't love him and didn't love her family. He went back to the same grimy place as before. Robert invited Stephen to meet him at a fancy restaurant. After smelling the money-driven atmosphere, Stephen realized he could twist the knife even deeper. Robert sided with Stephen, lambasting Catherine as a shameful and inhumanly cruel woman. He thanked Stephen for the novel, which had revealed the truth to him. That night, Nick made a rare phone call to Catherine, but he didn't know what to say. He just cried uncontrollably. He later overdosed on drugs and collapsed in the room. His so-called friends, afraid of taking responsibility, dumped him at the hospital entrance and ran away. Having not heard from Nick all night, Catherine frantically rushed home. She was terrified that Stephen had done something to him. Robert, however, thought Catherine was only worried about her reputation and continued to taunt her with hurtful remarks. In Nick's room, Catherine found a pack of cigarettes and a termination letter revealing he had been fired a long time ago. They finally realized how little they knew or cared about their son. Just then, Catherine received a call from the hospital. She rushed there to learn that Nick's nervous system had been damaged from the overdose, and it was unknown when he would wake up. Robert's emotions grew more complicated. He wasn't worried about his family falling apart. He was furious that Jonathan's heroic sacrifice for Nick had cost him his manhood forever. Robert contacted Stephen again. Upon hearing about Nick's hospitalization, Stephen couldn't hide his joy. He put on Jonathan's favorite deodorant and Nancy's pink knitted cardigan, as if the three of them were fighting a battle together. Stephen squeezed out a highly corrosive cleaning agent and went to the hospital with a spring in his step. Robert had already spoken with the nurses, telling them an old man would be visiting, so Stephen had no trouble getting to his target, Nick, who was lying in the bed, barely clinging to life. Fortunately, Catherine returned to the room just in time to stop Stephen, who was about to act. Stephen pretended to trip, hitting his head on a nearby box, while the nurses removed an emotionally distraught Catherine from the room. Stephen's acting was so convincing that he fooled everyone. Robert sincerely apologized to Stephen, promising that he could visit Nick anytime. Late at night, Stephen was awakened by a noise downstairs. He carefully went to check and found the front door had been broken down. Catherine was standing in the yard. She calmly walked into the house with Stephen and sat at the dining table, ready to tell him the truth about what happened 20 years ago. She didn't notice Stephen putting a drug into her tea. The story was similar to the novel. The difference was that Catherine hadn't intentionally teased Jonathan with her bikini. The trip was a source of great joy and relaxation for Catherine. She wasn't lonely, and she enjoyed the rare, peaceful time she spent with her son. After the night with Jonathan, Catherine was indeed exhausted and didn't have the energy to play with Nick. She bought him a small boat and fell asleep on the beach. When she woke up, all she saw was a long drag mark in the sand. Nick was already far out at sea. Catherine waded in, but the waist-high water terrified her and stopped her in her tracks. At that critical moment, Jonathan plunged forward and, with the help of two other men, managed to save Nick. As for Jonathan, Catherine didn't care. She watched him struggle in the waves, secretly wishing he would die. The reason was not what the novel claimed, that she was afraid of him pestering her. The truth was that the affair the night before hadn't been consensual. Jonathan, spoiled by his parents, Stephen and Nancy, was a truly rebellious boy. He had broken into Catherine's room with a weapon, forced her to take many photos, and made her smile happily in them. For her and Nick's safety, Catherine had no choice but to cooperate. What happened next was self-explanatory. As for why Catherine refused to tell Nancy the truth when she came to see her, the reason was simple. How could Catherine tell a terminally ill woman that her son was a complete monster? Catherine's confession to Stephen was just an attempt to make him stop his revenge on her family, but it was too late. The drug began to take effect, and she collapsed, weak, on the floor. Stephen's revenge was only one final step away. Nick had woken up, but he lay silently in the hospital bed, expressionless. The nurse told Robert that Nick needed rest and advised him to go out for some fresh air. Stephen had already arrived at the hospital. He slowly approached the nurse's station and lied, saying the head nurse had given him permission to see Nick. Nick's heart rate was stable, and his body was gradually recovering. Stephen took out the powerful cleaning agent he had prepared and was about to act when he heard Nick call out, "Mom." The sound had nothing to do with Stephen, but it was enough to make him remember a lot. Stephen suddenly understood everything. He didn't have the courage to harm Nick. Instead, he told Robert every last bit of the truth. After the drug wore off, a recovered Catherine rushed to the hospital. Robert finally understood he had misunderstood her and gave her a long overdue apology. It was all over. Stephen burned the novel's original manuscript, the photos Jonathan had taken, and Nancy's pink knitted cardigan. Suddenly, he pulled one photograph from the fire. Upon closer inspection, he saw a boy standing in the corner. It was Nick, 20 years ago. He had seen everything. Perhaps he couldn't process the scene he witnessed, so as an adult, Nick had forced himself to forget it. This explained why Nick would get annoyed whenever his parents brought it up. Sometimes people use anger to cover up their guilt. In the end, even though Robert apologized, Catherine insisted on divorcing him. The most heartbreaking part for her was that Robert found it easier to believe she had been forced into something than to accept that she had simply enjoyed it.